Okay, so thank you, Nandini, and welcome to all participants. Today's webinar, as Nandini highlighted, that it's going to talk about the financing and where the money will come from to operationalize transit-oriented development in Indian cities. And the larger part of this conversation will focus on the land value capture component um, of TOD and how it can actually help realize different components, different principles, and help take off TOD off ground as of now. So through our previous webinars, we've learned that for adopting TOD in any city, we need to consider 6 components, namely institutional setup, regulatory framework, mapping, design interventions, financing, and monitoring and evaluation. This webinar will be focusing on financing as highlighted. The purpose of this webinar is to impart understanding of various value capture mechanisms that may contribute to facilitate TOD planning and implementation. Studies have indicated that if the land use and transport integration, what we popularly refer to as TOD, in cities is done right, investments made in public transit have potential to generate 10 times in economic value for a city in just over 2 decades, in part by reducing the gap between people's need and access to resource and economic opportunities, and by avoiding significant health spending due to long commutes and road fatalities. Let's look at some of the challenges that exist for operationalizing TOD. You all may have listened to these, but the idea is to dwell upon the critical challenges for solutions. Due to lack of enabling frameworks, regulatory and institutional gaps, cities so far have not been able to capture these gains, and at the moment, few stakeholders in India seem to know how to get TOD off the ground. Operationalization of TOD typically spans many years, requiring significant capital investment, which is burdensome on public coffers, often without definitive returns until the project has been completed and in use. So financing TOD is one of the most critical elements for its successful implementation, necessitating that newer, innovative revenue-generating strategies are identified. Across these models, we believe that for such projects to be successful, all actors involved in TOD, namely financiers, developers, and the government, need to be able to benefit equitably. Each of their roles in enabling the use of LVC are important, and their shared understanding is vital to positive urban planning process. This is posing to be a huge lacuna in the current discourse, with lopsided benefits leading to poor implementation and scaling of TOD. This slide basically explains the project cycle with public and private stakeholders. Various milestone stages highlight the financing considerations during pre-construction, construction, and operation stages of the project. So let us understand what TOD investment is. It is the allocation of resources by public, private, and other stakeholders that are expected to generate the range of benefits associated with TOD. There are 4 critical dimensions to TOD investments, and the first one is investment components. That is, what needs to be financed. The investment components are the basic ingredients of an investment. They include parts of an investment that shape its performance and contribute to investment's costs and revenues over the course of planning, implementation, operation, and maintenance stages. There are 3 different types of investment components: tangible, intangible, and processes. All 3 component types are essential to investment. To our understanding, these components like physical infrastructure, which are more of tangible components, social infrastructure, which are intangible, and processes will need financing. In this particular slide, we've tried to list as many as possible, but this is not a limited list. This is by and large comprehensive. And today, in Indian scenarios, we usually see when it comes to physical infrastructure, it is more about either land, or it is more about the transit tracks at the moment. So, but a comprehensive approach towards investing towards TOD as a whole is something that is still amiss in this current discourse. The second critical component of TOD investment is delivery mechanisms. That is, who will channelize the whole process. Now, delivery mechanisms are the contractual, legal, institutional, and commercial relationships and framework that structure interactions between stakeholders over the course of infrastructure investment. Through an investments delivery mechanism, the benefit of the investment are realized, payments and repayments take place, and risks are managed. Though different investments combine different delivery mechanisms, the type of delivery mechanisms selected have great implications on the investment. How delivery mechanisms align interests and structure relationships can affect how funding sources are targeted at investment companies. The third critical dimension to TOD investment is financial products. That is, from where the financing will be mobilized and how it will be prepaid. Infrastructure investments are generally capital intensive and often require a large amount of upfront capital expenditure. Stakeholders usually need to obtain access to third-party capital to implement investments. Financial products are used by stakeholders to mobilize capital in support of an infrastructure investment. Unlike funding sources, financial products are financial services provided with the expectation of repayment, typically in the form of interest, coupons, dividends, or other type of fees. The fourth and the final critical component of TOD investment is funding sources. Where and how will it get financed in terms of revenue that will not need any repayment? Going forward, this webinar will focus on expanding funding sources, especially focusing on land value capture. Let's look at funding sources in more detail. An important distinction between funding sources and financial products, as I discussed earlier, is that the latter is financial service provided with the expectation of repayment, while the former is non-reimbursable value channel towards the cost of investment. As with any investment, a vital element of TOD investment is the revenues and other non-reimbursable monetary supports. There are three different types of funding sources for TOD investments, namely investment revenues, own sources, and investment incentives. In practice, these three types of funding sources are often combined with a single TOD investment in order to cover the various costs that arise from the investments. An additional important feature of funding sources is the timing at which they are available. Some materialize over the lifetime of an investment and are difficult to mobilize upfront, while some sources can be unlocked in the earliest stages of the project. Let's look at funding sources in more detail. Investment revenues are the revenues generated by TOD investment itself in the form of direct payments received in return of products and services. In the case of TOD, investment revenues can include revenues returned from service charges, land value increments, and air rights sales. Land value increments are revenues gained through land value capture. In land value capture, a public authority harnesses increases in the value of the land that are due to public actions or investments. Revenue collected from land value capture are typically channeled towards further public benefit or used to repay debts incurred for the investment. Investment revenues can also be gained through the transfer, exchange, or sale of air rights. The sale of air right involves the transfer or sale of public development rights. The sale of so-called air rights is the sale of the development rights or public claims on buildable area. Mechanisms used to implement the sale of air rights include auctioning of development rights and sale of density bonuses. Service charges are revenues obtained from charges applied to the use of transit service and from charges related to real estate assets. Transit services can obtain income from fare box revenues or transit use charges. This revenue is typically used to cover the cost of operation and maintenance of transit infrastructure. Real estate leasing is another form of service charge that can provide more stable and predictable source of revenue. Whereas own source revenues are existing public or private budgets that are directly mobilized for TOD investments through budgetary allocation, earmarking, or transfers. Governments at local, regional, or national scale can utilize their budgets for TOD implementation, allocating specific amounts of money to be spent on TOD projects and infrastructure. While existing budgets are useful components to bridge viability gaps in TOD investments, in particular for CAPEX, it is preferable to use investment revenues and incentives before resorting to other budgets for operational expenditures. Another funding source for TOD investments are investment incentives. In contrast to investment revenues like fair works or land value capture, investment incentives are not typically tied to overall financial success of TOD investment. Instead, investment incentives are designed to reduce the overall cost of an investment by providing incentives to stakeholders to join a TOD investment. Investment incentives typically come into play at an early stage in the investment process, often as a means of making TOD investment attractive to potential investors. Two different types of investment incentives are grants and fiscal incentives that can be used to catalyze TOD. Grants are contributions to a TOD investment in a monetary or physical asset form that can be received from public or private budgets. Public grants often play an important role in the early stages of TOD investment. Public grants can not only help to support expenses at the early stages of a TOD investment, they can also be used to lower the cost of finance for TOD investments. The grants available for a project vary widely based on context, but types of grants that have historically helped finance TOD investments include community development grants, land grants, and these can be in form of money or in form of land itself. Additional fiscal incentives that are used to catalyze TOD investments are often given in the form of reduced taxes, exemptions by public entities, including government at municipal, state, and central levels. In funding sources, value capture financing is one approach that has gained traction globally and recently is trying to find its place in Indian cities. Although traditionally value capture has been happening in Indian cities, but this is more in context of TOD and how to make the enforcement more robust in Indian cities. Essentially, the addition of transit infrastructure brings enormous increase to the value of land at prime locations due to enhanced accessibility that transport system provides. Value capture is a method of capturing this premium by requiring that the beneficiaries contribute towards the cost of building and operating the infrastructure and associated amenities. Value capture as practiced widely in the world is based on principle that private land and building benefits from public investments in infrastructure and policy decisions of governments. Appropriate land value capture financing tools can be deployed to capture a part of increment in the value of land and buildings. This generates a virtuous cycle in which value is created, realized, and captured and used again for project investment. In India, recently, national TOD policy and metro rail policy mandate the adoption of TOD and encourages the use of contextualized value capture financing to leverage the premiums that are brought by the mass transit system, thus making it to find alternate innovative financing strategies through land value capture mechanisms to supplement traditional funding sources is a necessary requirement. Traditionally, the use of value capture instruments have been to cover the unearned increments to the value of land. However, more recent value capture methods have focused on financing the cost of infrastructure investments by capitalizing on increased value of land around the project area. For example, Delhi Metro Phase 3 and Hyderabad Metro. Cities in India have experimented with different mechanisms and models, often applying them in combination to improve efficiency and revenue generation. Let's look at various value capture mechanisms. Value capture mechanisms are of three types, namely tax-based, fee-based, and development-based. Tax-based and fee-based each has 6 mechanisms, and development-based has 5 mechanisms. This particular table is showing the glimpse of value capture mechanisms as used in Indian and global geographies. Out of these 17 mechanisms, property tax, fee for change of land use, development charges or impact fee, premium on additional FAR, and compounding fee are some of the widely used mechanisms in India. This chart is showing the frequency and scale of intervention of few popular value capture mechanisms as used in Indian cities. And the figure is depicting the state of value capture mechanisms in few Indian cities that WRI India is looking at. Let's try and quickly understand the benefits and challenges of having value capture and trying to kind of really enforce value capture in this discourse. So benefits are optimizing land. Since land is a scarce resource, TOD tries to optimize the use of urban land and the underlying infrastructure, leading to efficient service delivery. It allows the use of innovative mechanism to generate revenues from land other than from its direct sales. Financial sustainability. Land value capture from TOD raises revenue for urban local bodies, which become less dependent on government funding and or government-backed loans, and therefore also less liable. Private parties to TOD would also shoulder some costs and risks, thereby ensuring that benefits are fairly distributed. Social and environmental gains. TOD creates safe, inclusive environments while promoting mass transit ridership, which in turn reduces emissions and improves local air quality. Well, this is one of the direct benefits that we see when we actually try to implement TOD in its full form. On the other hand, the challenges are institutional coordination. Absence of incentives and mechanisms for institutional coordination among various government and transit agencies. Lack of clear, fair, and transparent rules for cost, profit, and risk sharing among stakeholders. Planning frameworks. Lack of an integrated and tiered planning framework with suitable development control regulations undermine the potential of TOD and land value capture. Awareness and capacity. Common language and understanding of land value capture implementation and benefits are lacking among stakeholders. They also lack capacity of planning and execution of financial arrangements. Implementation. TOD implementation typically entails long gestation period and requires significant capital investments, as we have discussed earlier. However, this aspect of TOD is yet to see light in Indian cities. We also see that there are lopsided fiscal flows, intergovernmental transfers, and inelastic taxation structures inhibit value creation and revenue generation. So to our mind, when we've looked at various value capture mechanisms, looked at how Indian cities are trying to adopt and incorporate it, we could list these very clear benefits and challenges. However, a lot of it is changing. It is changing with time slowly, but we are yet to be there to be saying that this is how we've nailed it for Indian cities. Let's look at how Indian cities are capturing land value in context of rapid transit. We closely looked at 4 cities: Delhi, Bangalore, Ahmedabad, and Hyderabad. And what we found is that one, there is a common sense of there is an equity by the central government and the state governments. They are trying to commit to this particular cause, but there is a lot of other components that are yet to happen. When we looked at this, we realized that the revenue that is being generated from land value capture is largely invested towards the development of transit in different cities. Now, when we also looked at it closely, we realized that there are certain other aspects of land value capture which are only in the proposal stage and are yet to be operationalized or enforced. So right now, what is working in this arena is station retail, advertising rights, and property development rights. This is how they're trying to earn the revenue. The land value capture currently is being used for financing transit only. No city has set up a city TOD fund. Although our national TOD policy does talk about that we need to set up a TOD fund for a particular city. While there are instances where dedicated transit funds or infrastructure funds are being created, but they are largely used to develop the infrastructure one. And by infrastructure, I mean only the transit. and secondly, they are not very specific to TOD at all. So what is required to be done is the TOD specific funding, where you generate revenue from those TOD areas, and and then again reinvest to either maintain, operate, or expand those TOD areas. So that is something that we do not have at the moment in our cities. Besides, sharing costs, benefits, and risks are also not clearly worked out among government agencies. So I think these are certain aspects which we found when we looked at these four cities very closely. And these cities are also evolving. They are also working towards bettering these mechanisms. But it's taking time and it's still evolving. That is the state of affairs. Now, after looking at these case examples, we also have certain other learnings, that could probably help inform cities and maybe take certain specific steps to better them. So we categorize these into under broad four categories. The first one is institutional setup. So streamline institutional structures where transit agencies and urban local bodies work jointly on planning of value creation. That is something that is really important and is needed. Appointment of nodal agency that coordinates between multiple stakeholders. We understand that there are certain coordination agencies, but I think they need to be empowered a little more so that they can create this efficiency in the system. Clear-cut agreements between stakeholders and aligned mandates for different agencies should be determined early in the process. So, for example, when we see that there are changes, if we see certain metros, their phases, from phase 1 to phase 2 to phase 3, they have also evolved over a period of time, which is great. But I think a better alignment of mandates and clarity from the initial stages of the projects would help more. On the implementation front, relevant stakeholders should jointly evaluate and determine transit routing, developable lands, planning, zoning parameters, and NBC estimates. FAR thresholds and premiums should be carefully considered, fixed and operationalized. Town planning schemes typically employed in new growth areas is an efficient and equitable self-financing mechanism to deliver planned and service land for development, while also providing space for public goods. On the regulatory framework, institute local or station area plans define TOD zones and their development control regulations and incorporate these into city master plans. Incentivizing a holistic approach to TOD, which goes beyond premium FARs, would lead to desirable development and optimal LBC around transit stations. A tiered planning system aids in the creation of contextual plans with area-specific regulations. At micro level, these detailed plans help identify gaps in infrastructure carrying capacities and augmentation needed to support TOD. Regulations should be flexible and responsive to diverse local needs, carrying capacities and changing market demands. On the financial arrangement front, as recommended by the national TOD policies, cities should set up TOD funds so that LBC is used to finance TOD and not just transit systems. A fair sharing model which does not accrue disproportionate benefits to certain stakeholders over others should be determined through collaborative engagement. An authority should be identified for the collection and disbursement of LBC revenues and its utilization in accordance with share ratios. This might be happening in certain places, in certain cities now, but it's still not really a TOD fund. Value capture is happening in some cities. For example, Bengaluru has started to do that, but I think it has a lot of scope to evolve and have a better mechanism of disbursement. Local governments should find convergence with and leverage funds from other national state programs to finance transit and TOD. Now, where should VCF revenue be used? That's another question that pops up in mind. And current financing mechanisms of mass transit in cities are focused on funding the metro infrastructure. However, other physical infrastructure like water supply networks, sewage networks, etc., and social infrastructure like public spaces, affordable housing, etc., are yet to be seen in a similar perspective. So, although existing policy frameworks recognizes TOD as key development tool, innovative mechanisms that are financially sustainable are still under exploration. Let's look at some global examples of how things were done in certain global cities. I am going to start with Shenzhen Rail Plus property model project. Shenzhen is the first city in mainland China to successfully implement Rail Plus property development, with decreasing capital investment by Shenzhen city government. Shenzhen's designation as special economic zone has given it more freedom to innovate under the prevalent dynamics of institutional and regulatory frameworks. Now, the funding and financing of Rail Plus property project is taken care by both state-owned and state governments and private-owned companies. It leverages partnership between the public sector, rail transit companies, and real estate developers for coordinated investment, construction, and operation of transit infrastructure and property development adjacent to station areas. At Shenzhen, Mayor's office is the final decision-making authority, which created two organizations, namely Development and Reform Commission and Urban Rail Transit Office, with defined roles and responsibilities. The Development and Reform Commission was appointed as a lead agency with responsibility for approving the construction and funding of metro systems, as well as establish the financial arrangement of R+P projects. Besides, the Urban Rail Transit Office is set up to coordinate and coordinate the communication and negotiation amongst government agencies, research institutions, and metro companies. The R+P development took place in 3 phases. In phase 1, the implementation, construction, project financing were being taken care by the project company, that is Shenzhen Metro Group Corporation. But in its 3rd phase of development, government decided to bring in another party and created consortium of Shenzhen Metro Group and Hong Kong MTR Corporation. The Shenzhen municipal government realized that R+P was completely new territory for the subway companies, and R+P project raised the overall project cost. Thus, city government decided to reduce its role and include private developers. At this stage, government only wanted to use land as an equity and created ways such as build, operate, transfer or build, transfer to commission developers. Let's look at it in little more detail. In each phase, we will be discussing about each phase. So phase 1, Shenzhen city government invested total 70% of capital investment, and remaining 30% was borrowed by the banks and government guarantees. In phase 2, the city government invested totally 50% of capital. Government employed special auctions to transfer land to survey companies, refunded land concession fees paid by metro company. Shenzhen Metro Group commissioned developers through a build and transfer agreement for property development. In phase 3, the government granted the undeveloped land to the project company through a tripartite agreement between Shenzhen Urban Planning, Land and Resource Commission, the State-Owned Assets Supervision and Administration Commission. The land equities were added to the company assets, allowing it to use as collateral. The Shenzhen municipal government and MTR entered into BOT contract. So, if you really see this growth from 1998 to 2016, they have evolved from actually investing a government corpus fund in TOD development to actually only to the land equity investment. Now, the R+P development possesses new challenges to China's existing planning process. Therefore, Shenzhen has made many bold innovations in planning systems. Now, let's understand that how they've done that. They've aligned vision for R+P and multi-stakeholder engagement. What they did is matching property development with market demand through market analysis and phase construction timelines. To mitigate mismatched supply, development is planned centrally and enabling coordination among properties as part of overall city plans as well as local contexts. balancing short-term interests of property profitable with long-term social goals, increase infrastructure carrying capacities to accommodate intensive development, coordinated decision-making enables more market-responsive processes and value creation potential. Project company and multiple government agencies jointly evaluate and decide upon metro companies. The other thing that they did was integrated transit land use and financial planning. Integration between rail and land use plans streamlined different phases of rail transit plans and adjust planning process as needed to create synergies and enable TOD around stations. Synchronization of urban planning and survey financial plans. Urban and financial planning are closely connected. Shenzhen's planning department considers scale, use, location, and intensity of property as important parameters of funding arrangements for the R+P projects. Flexible regulatory zoning, case-by-case adjustments. Shenzhen allows different densities for residential and office developments around transit stations, allowing adjustments based on the need of the site development proposals. Specific control zones. Shenzhen encourages a flexible land use type for land parcels surrounding transit stations, and hence allows developers and governments to specify zoning codes for R+P projects when stations locations are determined before zoning of areas. Shenzhen has total of 14 R+P projects, 7 of which were launched in phase 2 and other 7 were launched in phase 3. These R+P projects can be broadly categorized into 2 types. Projects which were undertaken on the periphery of urbanized areas and the projects that were undertaken in the urban centers. Now, when we looked at this case study, we also tried to derive certain key learnings out of that. Again, categorized in the 4 heads. In the institutional setup, we realized that various agencies from both public and private sector were involved. But mayor is the supreme power and decision maker for all. So a learning that we need to take is that there needs to be a pivotal office that needs to drive this whole process. Clear agreements between stakeholders and multiple stakeholders were done at an early stages. On the front of implementation, Shenzhen's R+P model was divided into 3 phases for smooth functioning and implementation of the project. The phases were created for a time span of 5 years, each which led to total project duration of 15 years. Regulations and planning norms were clearly laid out for proper necessary adoption. Incorporation of land use and transit integration helped project move in a better manner, avoiding clashes in zoning at the later stages. On financial arrangements, various revenue generation sources were adopted. Clear framework between 4 major key players, namely Shenzhen Metro Group, MTR Group, Shenzhen City Government and developers has been laid. Phase-wise funding and financing was being taken care of by different agencies respectively. Involvement of private sector through various funding mechanisms such as auctions, TDR, BOT model, and proper utilization of public sector funding was undertaken. On the regulatory framework, innovations in planning framework and integration of transit, land use, and financial planning is being done. Flexible zoning codes around transit stations to meet changing market demands. Incorporation of transit-oriented development in urban master and regulatory plans. Financial arrangements, integrated urban and transit planning frameworks and various policy reforms were adopted. Regulated FAR in case of rolling stock depot was adopted as per project demand, thus giving leverages in FAR consumption and according to the users. Innovative vertical division of land use rights in city centers to deal with land availability limitation. So this slide is basically talking about a basic comparison between how Hong Kong did it and how Shenzhen was different from Hong Kong. The rail plus property development in Hong Kong and Shenzhen leverages the partnership between the public sector, transit companies, and developers to coordinate planning and financing of transit systems and adjacent real estate developments. By capturing the land value appreciation that follows transit projects, R plus P can partly or completely fill the funding gaps in constructing costly infrastructure projects. Compared to financing tools such as infrastructure bonds and bank loans, R plus P provides a new stream of funding for construction and operation of public transit facilities without creating additional debt burdens. This particular slide is more of a summary comparison between Hong Kong and Shenzhen with respect to different components and how it was dealt with in each of the cases. I'm not going to go into too much detail of this. The next example on the list is the Hudson Yards. A lot of you might be familiar of this example, but I will try to touch upon certain specifics in this project and how it actually panned out at a district level scenario and how it actually became an example in the arena of TOD. Hudson Yards is a large-scale development program of railway yards at district level that is planned, funded, and constructed under a set of agreements among the City of New York, the State of New York, and the Metropolitan Transit Authority. The aim was to expand the Midtown Manhattan Business Center westward to the Hudson River. So this is a location that is existing in New York City, where this whole Hudson Yards is being built. So if you look at the institutional setup for Hudson Yards project, the Hudson Yards Development Corporation was established by the City of New York in 2005. It spearheads the implementation of city's Hudson Yards development program. For the development of Hudson Yards program, the Hudson Yards Development Corporation, famously known as HYDC, collaborates with various city and state entities and agencies that are involved in financing, planning, development, and construction. So when they wanted to take up this Hudson Yards redevelopment project, what all did they take? What all activities that they undertook which helped this whole project of Hudson Yards come up? They undertook the rezoning of the far west side. This rezoning was done twice, that is in 2005 and 2009. In 2005, the New York City Council approved the 60-block rezoning, including the eastern portion of the West Side Yard and excluding the western portion. The Western Yard was included in the rezoning and financing district in 2009. So let me just step back and basically give a premise of what this Eastern and Western Yard is. So Hudson Yards is a place in New York where basically it was, as the name suggests, that it was a yard. It was a railway yard, which was like a whole in the entire city. And this entire yard had a west wing and an east wing. Now these two wings were although connected, but it was like an underground system. And till this Hudson Yards project came up, this entire area was completely like a whole in the entire city of New York. Now the authorities in New York City wanted to kind of give an uplift to this particular area, and they came up with this whole idea of doing Hudson Yards as a project where they wanted to maximize on the air rights or the airspace which was above these yards. And that's how the whole Hudson Yards project came into existence. These are certain key activities that they had taken under to make this happen. So the rezoning, they did the property acquisition, they did drafting and implementation of financial incentives, they adopted new zoning regulations, so they created certain manuals that could be referred to. So that when whoever is involved in developing the whole Hudson Yards is actually aware of what needs to be done and how the whole process is laid out. Various projects that were undertaken under Hudson Yards were extension of New York City's subway line, they did the Eastern and Western rail yards were undertaken for development, like I mentioned. So they basically created a platform and they developed the entire Hudson Yards over that. So they undertook public amenities called Hudson Park and Boulevard, where they wanted to ensure that each and every development that is coming up is comprehensive in its own way. In addition to these specific projects, since Hudson Yards uh, is a district level intervention, there is a specific parcel of land that is called Hudson Yards, which is Eastern and Western rail yards, and above that there is the whole development. But the larger area is Hudson Yards district, and in that particular district, not only this particular site of Hudson Yards, but there were other projects that were taken up. There were other major public projects that were taken up, which were adjacent to this whole Hudson Yards area, and they had their own funding and financing mechanisms, which we are not going to discuss. But I can list the projects that were undertaken, and the projects were Highland Park, Hudson River Park, Justice Convention Center, Marshalling Yard, Moynihan Station, Madison Square Garden. So all these projects were taken up in the surrounding, in the vicinity of area, and that's what basically comprised of the Hudson Yards district. Now, to fund the physical infrastructure improvements, including the subway lines, the Eastern and Western railway yards, parks, streets, the Hudson Yards Redevelopment Area District Improvement Fund was created. Revenue for this district improvement fund was generated through the following mechanisms: sales of FAR, TDR or air rights, property sales, sales on ground or ground lease of public owned property, tax increment financing, basically property tax on new residential developments, payment in lieu of sales taxes or other taxes. So they were basically creating a corpus to undertake this whole expansion of and redevelopment of this Hudson Yards area. Now, certain key learnings from Hudson Yards as an example. This is one example which has many facets. I am not going to cover all the facets of this particular project in interest of time, but I will be sharing these key learnings that probably can become some inspiration for Indian cities. And again, I've categorized them under 4 categories. So institutional setup, streamlined institutional structure with defined roles and responsibilities, where stakeholders or agencies working jointly on planning, development and construction of value creation. A nodal agency that coordinates between multiple stakeholders was created. Clear-cut agreements between stakeholders and aligned mandates for different agencies were determined early in the process. As far as implementation framework is concerned, long-term developments over a span of 30 years in phased manner was envisaged early in the development processes. Enabling regulations and planning norms were clearly laid out for proper necessary adoption. FAR thresholds and premiums were determined for the entire district, along with their operational modalities for timely implementation and functioning. Critical land acquisitions were undertaken by public agency while allocating suitable incentives to the affected. Infrastructure augmentation was an important component of the entire development so that it is suitable. I think this is one very critical learning for Indian cities. On the financial setup end, several revenue sources and combination of land value capture mechanisms have been used. Extensive involvement of private sector and utilization of private sector funding is seen in this particular example. The Hudson HYIDC is the agency for financing the projects and is responsible for managing the district improvement fund. So there is a particular agency which was dedicated to do the fund management for this particular redevelopment project. The regulatory framework, District level plans were instituted along with necessary development control regulations for each project within the Hudson Yards district. A holistic approach is adopted to ensure public good while maximizing on FAR component and giving impetus to overall economic development of the district. So if we really see certain aspects, when we look at these global cases, we have had an experience where people come back and tell us that, this may not work as far as Indian cities are concerned. But we always end up telling them that it may not work if you try to do a copy-paste scenario. But what you need to also do is to contextualize certain aspects, certain components, certain learnings in your own way, and innovate for making things, making the livability quotient better for Indian cities, for making things better for the people of the cities. And I think with the kind of urban expansion that Indian cities are now facing, especially when we compare big data, big numbers, we may come back saying that compared to XYZ geography, this particular city in India or our cities are not expanding that much. True to a large extent, but the issue here is that whatever expansion that is happening, that is not a service expansion. And especially with the limited kind of resources and capacities, how much can our city agencies do? And if they have to do better, then certain concepts like TOD might help them to do better and make better cities. So with this, I'm going to end the webinar, and the forum is open for any questions. Somebody has asked that what are the potential TOD projects in India which are being supported by central government and regional financial institutions like ADB or National Financial. There are certain projects that are being done by Gujarat government, where they have looked at, they are basically working with their own land banks to develop good examples as far as TOD concepts are concerned. So they've identified lands in Ahmedabad city along the BRTS corridor and now again along the metro corridors, and they are trying to undertake the development of that. It's a slow process, but the Ahmedabad authorities are definitely doing it day in and out, and they have. So with the kind of mechanisms that they play, for example, they have this whole TPS town planning schemes as an approach of doing it. So they are also trying to do an infill kind of a development with TPS as a base scheme in mind. And so I think Ahmedabad is one city. Another city is Delhi, which basically tried to launch the whole TOD pilot projects, but unfortunately those projects have not taken up. They haven't seen any. There is no on-ground implementation so far as those projects are concerned. But what they did was that they did a consortium with the NBCC in Delhi, where NBCC was responsible to undertake the development as far as its designing and its implementation is concerned. But where it is, what we understand, that it is held up because the regulations for TOD is not really finalized. However, the authorities are looking at how they can do that for the city, and hopefully if we have certain regulations that are cleared and are firm, then we will also see some action on ground. Besides that, certain cities under Smart Cities program have also done proposals which incorporate TOD as one of their area, and they are approaching it as an area-based planning work, which is a good way of taking up TOD in your school cities and basically trying to apply the core principles of TOD in their own way, in their own contextual way. So I think there are a lot of cities that are looking at that. And since being an urban development scenario, things will take time to be on ground, and we will see results as the time passes by. So somebody has asked that how TOD and financing TOD through land value capture affects the affordability in the area. So I think this question needs a little bit of decoupling, because land value capture is more in context of in a different way. So affordability has various facets, if we really see. For some, and a lot of it also comes from the kind of priority people have in terms of how they want to move, how they want to travel, what kind of lifestyle they want to see. But land value capture, a part of land value capture, also affects, because a lot of people come back saying that why we should come and invest, why we should come and give more taxes, for example, if we are near or within that TOD zone. Then there are also issues where people because there is a whole land value aspect of it, the pricing of these properties, these lands, they do increase to a certain extent. But I think it is also quite related to how the supply and demand is working. If the supply is enough, then the break even would be faster. But definitely affordability is one big question that we need to kind of look at. How can we implement Hudson experience in Indian cities? So I think one, we need to also understand the components of how Hudson Yards have come up, over a period of time. One of the biggest components in that is the whole institutional setup, and second is the kind of time commitment they've had for this particular intervention. Then the willingness of developers sector is another aspect. So I think to my mind, it actually starts with an initiative. For example, if some of you must have seen that even Indian Railways is trying to address this kind of, undertake this kind of concept to a city where land is a constraint, and they would still want to do a redevelopment and still have a state-of-the-art development. So, for example, I remember reading one of the news articles where IRSGC came back saying that they would want to experiment it in a city like Mumbai. So I think Hudson Yards experience in land-crunch cities would be a definite, definitely it can be experimented. And the idea here is to also have an informed decision making, because, for example, the kind of flexibility in a city like New York has, considering that the way they kind of formulate their zonings and laws may not really exist in Indian cities. So we will have to follow a process where we can actually try understanding how we can implement it. Another aspect of this would be how we can bring in the whole conversation of local area planning in this, because TOD is not just about stations, it is also about the development around it. So I think the whole approach of area-based planning, where we have local area planning approach of catering to these transit and surrounding areas, I think that is one way of looking at how you can actually bring in the whole Hudson Yards experience in Indian cities. Somebody is asking, can you elaborate more on air rights, on air shapes? So I think I would pass this question, because air rights and air sales is a subject in itself, and probably in future I might actually come back with a full-fledged webinar on that subject. But you can, whoever has posted this question can connect to me offline, and I'm happy to have a conversation on that. How land use restructuring yield maximum from TOD? I think these are some questions that I've already dealt with when we were looking at how TOD concepts in my previous webinars, basically how we are, looking at doing the, for example, if I take up the component of FAR and how we can do the redistribution and optimize the land utilization and that, and then how we can be more flexible in terms of placing certain type of uses in certain areas, and how we can actually categorize the whole TOD zones or TOD areas in a city. So I think I would suggest that you need to go back and refer to the whole TOD, the first webinar of TOD, where we tried to discuss the whole methodology around this question. So somebody is asking how to balance between self-finance and affordability, because people using transit will need affordable houses in the vicinity. I agree completely, because we need to cater to the whole affordable housing aspect of it. And the larger question to me is, one, even if in today's scenario, the laws or bylaws, they do have a provision of providing affordable housing in transit-rich areas, and they ensure that there is a component of affordable housing that is built. If you look at Delhi's TOD policy, it actually goes down to defining what kind of housing you need to have in those areas. But the larger question, or the following question to this, is how to maintain them as an affordable housing. I think that is where we're still finding answers to that, because affordable housing provisioning is there, as far as norms are concerned, that is available in the norms, and the norms are catering to that. But the fact of the matter is that how does market behave? So I will share one example. I've been doing this research on impact of transits on housing affordability, and hopefully in future we will be sharing some part of that study as a webinar. But that is a big question, because what happens is market doesn't behave the way you feel that it might behave, because market says that if there is a transit that is coming, then I may not do any sale transaction or any kind of transaction with respect to housing, because once the infrastructure is there, I have the rates going up. So the thing is that the larger question is the maintenance of affordable housing, and I have been saying it time and again that one is the sale aspect of it, where everybody wants to own housing. Another is that can we also open the rental market, because a larger supply will always help balance out these extremities. If we do not have a supply which is affordable enough for people, then this question will always come again and again. And besides that, the issue is that rental market is very weak in our cities, and a lot of our cities also, for example, especially metropolitan cities, if we talk about, so they have a population which does not really are the resident of these cities. So if a rental market is robust for such population who are here for work, then I think this kind of question probably will start seeing the day of light, and it will be much more sorted as far as affordability is concerned.